Welcome to the Aftershock, everyone. A number of us here tonight. Alex Morgan will be joining us also momentarily. Jamon Moore here with Asher Kohn. Haven't seen Asher in a while. Good to have you on tonight. Robert Jonas, Colin Etnire, and here's the man himself, Alex Morgan, adding him in as we're kicking off here. Guys, thanks for doing this. It's been a season, not with the best results. But now we're, I think, looking at a team that is set up very interestingly also for the offseason. So we got a lot to talk about. Let's take a look, back on the season very quickly here. But let's, plan to really kind of get into this offseason and how we expect to see it develop. And really excited for all the fans joining us here tonight. Make sure to put your comments in the chat. And we will also make sure that we take any sort of questions that you have as we get going along the way. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Asher, it's been the longest, I think, since we heard from you. I'm going to give you the chance to get on and get going here first. Give us your minute of what did you think we learned this season? What's your biggest takeaway from it? And is there anything that you're longing to see that we didn't even get to see?
A winning season, a playoff season, a 35-game season. Yeah, any of that would be great to see. I noted that Stu Berman already got a comment in there. Wait, when did the season end? It ended sometime in August, maybe July. It's been a bummer, and I haven't been around much because I just had a really hard time keeping enthusiasm for these folks, to be honest. But it's great to see you all. It's great to be back here with all that aside. And, in terms of, I think it's going to be a really interesting offseason. I think, a lot of us be watching the World Cup. I think we're going to be able to learn a lot about what the Quakes are going to look like in 2023, watching that World Cup, watching how the U.S. national team plays and seeing how that might translate to the Earthquakes personnel. And I think that'll be really, really informative, really interesting for people who are both national team fans and Quakes fans. And hopefully we'll be able to see how those pieces might come together, might see some interesting transfers. There's always really wacky transfer seasons right after World Cup ends. Hopefully San Jose take advantage of that and get some players they really, really need, which I'm sure we're going to talk about throughout the show. Just they need a lot, and we can talk a lot about that. But there's something to look forward to now. This was a lost season, and it felt like that from the get-go with Almeida sticking around, not wanting to be there. None of the players seem to really be too enthusiastic about it, except for little stretches and blips. But hopefully, different preseason, different everything going into it, and we'll have things to talk about, not just have to make bleak jokes in the game chat in the Patreon Slack all the time.
Jamon, you got the mute on, my guy. It's gonna happen once the show.
It's gonna happen. I know. I'm trying to get some dinner over here at the same time, so I'm gonna go tight shots on everybody so I can eat. Right. No, it's Asher has been very involved actually in the patron Slack. So if you miss him, make sure that you're in the patron Slack so you can get your fill of Asher for sure. Colin, I'm going to kick it over to you next here. It's because you're on the East Coast, it's been tougher to get you on more recently, but you've been watching Quakes teams for a long time, and I think we both agreed that there's some really interesting pieces to this team. Did it ever really come together for you? And what are you left with?
Well, it's actually funny you should say that. I do when I think all of us, we love talking to our friends about the Quakes. Certainly, some of them are in our group chats and our phones, the patron Slack as well. That kind of the casual conversation that goes around the club. I do try to bring up the fact that when you're comparing the talent level that's on this roster right now to the talent level that was on this roster in 2015, which is the first year that I covered the club, it's a different universe. And MLS certainly has gotten better during that period of time, but I don't think that the improvement of MLS overall tracks with the disparity of quality there. So that's either saying one of two things. Either we have an underachieving unit right now, or, and by the way, it could be both of these things, or back then was really a really terrifyingly bad state of affairs, and we were lucky to ever have kind of much success at all. I think both of those are true to a certain extent. I think that this was absolutely a lost season, as Asher says. It was lost from the moment that they decided to retain Almeida into the season, and I think that is, I don't know who makes that call. I assume that call is made at the ownership level because it's a very big decision for the club and probably wouldn't be made by a Chris Leach who had just arrived on the job. And the dollar figures involved with buying out Almeida and his staff were quite large, so I'd imagine ownership would have had to pull the trigger. But the decision to bring him back was writing this season off entirely. They acquired, I think it was 3, maybe 4 points from their first 7 games. And there was nothing anyone could really do at that point to do any better. The problem was, though, to a certain extent, they did eventually realize that it was a lost season, and then they started making transactions accordingly. So selling Calvo, who made about $1 million a year for at least some kind of transfer fee, selling Marcos Lopez for the amount that they could get, which actually ended up bringing a pretty good fee as his contract was expiring. Those transactions made the team worse in the short run. But they're the kinds of things that add dollars for the next year. This will be a bit of a preview discussion topic that Jamon and I have talked a lot about one-on-one. But they did a lot of things to kind of write off. I kept on saying write off this season, go for the future. Playing the kids is part of that, but selling your sellable assets that aren't going to be there in the long run is also part of that. And they did do that. So they consigned this season to the dustbin of history when they brought Almeida back. Eventually and belatedly, they did the right thing by letting him go and then starting to make some moves for the future. The problem is painful short-term moves like that are hard to stomach for a fan base that has been asked to stomach quite a lot. And I think that they don't yet have the equity to kind of ask the fans to put up with that kind of thing. So that's the painful part for this season.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I think we'll get into that a bit more as we go through the night. Robert Jonas, great to have you much more a part of the team this year. I know you've had a set of personal commitments last season. You were able to get to the stadium more often this season. What stuck out to you during the 2021 season about this team? 2022 season, I'm sorry. What will you remember in hindsight?
Yeah, it's I've heard a few things here that get my attention. Number one, oops, did I disappear? I think I'm still there. But
I got you.
Okay, there I am. All right. So I was going to say you mentioned a couple of things there, which I think are key, which was that this was a transition season that lasted an entire season. The coaching change happened a little bit too late. The number one candidate I think we had talked about on this show, at least I had put forth from day one, was Luchi Gonzalez, and it took many months to close that deal. But it probably wasn't realistic that they were going to get him in the door right away, given his responsibilities and his commitment to the U.S. national team as they were getting qualified for the World Cup and now qualified for the World Cup. It was always going to be a courtship that was going to kind of take second place to that responsibility. And so, it was just waiting. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about what that next regime was going to be. And I think Chris Leach got the guy he wanted from day one. It just took till about day 200 to sign the contract. I think getting out to the stadium is an underrated experience, and folks who can get out there on a regular basis know seeing live soccer is cures a lot of ills in terms of what you're forced to watch sometimes when you do see these Quakes teams play. And I think for me, as someone who kind of remembers a lot of those highlights as opposed to the lowlights, that LAFC game really sticks in my mind as just an incredible night out, and the excitement and the thrills that everyone in that stadium was able to walk away with. Even your LA fans, maybe not the thrills they were hoping for, but it was just a night to remember. Is something that I'd like to see more often. I'd like to see when Luchi gets aboard that he's able to bring a bit of excitement that has been lacking for a number of years. So those are a couple of things that I want to go for. And it's funny you mentioned Almeida, and always the first thing that comes to mind is Jackson Ewell at center back, and just that's when I knew things were going to be off to an unfortunate start to 2022. Hopefully that never has to happen again.
I will say that the in-person games are usually a pleasure, but the 2 in-person games I attended this year was losing 3-0 to NYC in Yankee Stadium and losing 3-0 to Philadelphia Union, and probably the coldest I've ever been in my life in Philadelphia. So
they should
not always
pay you
that
to
good.
stop attending.
They really should.
Yeah, you really should go to those.
Set that aside in the budget. Yeah.
Colin's no longer allowed to attend any games. I happened to be at the game at Starfire, which was, pretty good. and got that one in. And then it kind of went downhill from there. I caught the 3-3 draw in Vancouver, and then the Portland game not so great, and then a little bit back on the upswing at the very end with Seattle. Alex, but speaking of a guy who was there throughout the season, whether in person, whether on the show, you and I have done this together for 4 years. My partner in crime, Alex, what's your take on this season?
Well, it's been a pleasure to work with you all again this season, and this season was particularly fun because it felt more like a normal season for the first time in a long time, where it felt like the club had really established a rhythm of attending home games. The fans were excited about the promise and the potential in this team. Even towards the end of the season, when they were knocked out of the playoffs, I think the fans could recognize, the talent of guys like Nico Shakiris, Benji Kikanovic, and the momentum that this team has going into next season. And look, I think Colin's right. Everybody knows that the Quakes doomed themselves the minute they decided to keep Matias Almeida on board at the beginning of this season. And it felt like, ever since that decision, they've been playing catch up the whole year. They eventually made all the right decisions. I think they eventually fired Matias Almeida. They eventually, signed Rodriguez and Trauco and Acapo and the defensive reinforcements that they needed. They eventually started to play Nico Shakiris in the midfield. But all those decisions just came a little bit too late, and they were always playing catch up. And I think that's what the story of the season feels like. And I don't think we've ever seen an Earthquake season with this much change over the course of the year. It felt like a completely different team at the beginning of the year than it was at the end of the year. The way that they were playing, the mentality that they had, and even if the results didn't necessarily improve in the way that they were hoping for, I feel like their outlook for next year is remarkably different than it was at the beginning of this year.
Jamon's twice now.
All right, I'm done with playing with the mute button tonight, unless my son comes running in, then I'll go back on. No, I'll give you my quick. My voice still isn't 100%, so I'm going to really rely on everyone to talk tonight and give your perspectives. But my very quick was, with Almeida. I mean, let me pull up some quick numbers here. With Almeida, I think Colin, you referred to it, right? This team had a -6 goal differential in 7 games, 11 goals for, 17 goals against, 3 points from draws. And had he stayed for the entire season at that rate, this team would have had, like 15 points for the whole season. With Covello, things improved a bit, but honestly, it never improved quite enough. 41 goals for, 52 goals against. That's a -11 goal differential on 27 games, 32 points. If he had been the coach for the whole season at that rate, that's 40 points. The bottom team in the playoffs in the West, I think, is 48 points, if I remember right off the top of my head. It's 8 points pace, difference. So things are going to have to be able to change for this team in order to be able to make up 8 points. I don't think under any season, Colin, with, whatever variability and, simulation you want to try to do, if you replayed it over and over again, even with Covello as the coach, I don't think that this team quite makes the playoffs. And it's interesting, you mentioned the potential of underachieving in this team. I think we saw just this wild level of variability that still exists within this team. And the thing that this team has to focus in on is, how do they decrease the amount of variability in their performances, game over game? I'll turn it over to you guys. What element of this team is causing this high level of variability? And thereby, if I look ahead to 2023, what is it that's going to need to change to bring some stability to the performance?
I was going to say, you gotta. There's so many of us. You got to pick one of us.
Pop up. Give me a pop up here.
I'm just going to go very quick.
So there's an old Chicago show, kind of like the sports writers, where 5 guys are sitting around the table. We got to do something like that here.
Can we have buzzers? Maybe we can buzz in like it's Jeopardy.
Yeah,
I'll do a quick one. I agree.
Pop up, and I'm going to start throwing up some fans from the comment or some comments from the fans.
I agree with part of what you just said, which is that if you simulated this season with all those variables in place or if Cabello in place the entire time, and they managed the roster the way they did, which is to say they sold Calvo in the middle of the season and they had kind of a gap, a threadbare portion of defense. Yes, that's not a playoff team. However, I think if you put a competent coach in there and you manage the roster very slightly differently, where you don't allow those kind of gaps to appear through the middle of the season, I think that's absolutely, there is playoff potential in this current team. So that's the one thing I would say. And it's not specifically to speak poorly of Alex Cabello, who's never managed a senior first team at a very high level before. But when you're a player and you're, getting coached by a guy who used to be coaching the youth teams, and he's an interim because there's an interim tag on it, they don't have the same level of authority that somebody else does. And so that's just something that makes it really difficult. And so I think that one variable alone is something that creates more solidity, is to have one coach through the year with some authority and with the kind of the mandate to develop over time.
I would add to that with, it's a very all or nothing defense and mostly nothing. But you had, whether it was Calvo, he was here, Nathan, Rodriguez needs to be very similar. There's no one who's like a consistent take the air out of the ball 2022 center back on this team. Beeson has a lot of those traits, but he's really not that sort of passer. Haven't seen a ton of Oscar Agren yet. There's times when you have like Nathan Rodriguez playing very high risk soccer and they're able to keep a high line and keep the other team. There were some clean sheets this year, which there really weren't during the Almeida era. That said, there were also just tons of times where Marcinkowski was getting shelled, and it was just really gruesome to watch at times. And I think that, we're going to like what this team needs. I think a big thing is just like a DP number 6, just a João Paulo, someone who can just take the game by its neck sometimes. And I think there was a lot of optimism. That might have been Jackson Ewell. For me, he's definitely been one of my favorite players in his tenure here. But it's clear, whether center back, 6, 8, he just isn't that sort of defensive presence. There was an interesting stat I noticed when I was kind of just clicking around fbref.com earlier this week, where they have a list of, who has the most errors that led directly to a shot. If you go through it, you rank most to least. It's mostly like not intelligent goalkeepers, just people who make dumb plays at the top of this list. Then you have just kind of some unlucky center backs. And Jackson Ewell is like right up there. And at first you look at like, wow, like he made some bad passes. We can't remember these bad passes. But then you realize how bad a defense has to be to have a missed pass in midfield go directly into a shot. And you really realize there's this huge structural deficiency that we saw under Almeida. We saw a whole lot under Michael Stare. We really haven't seen anything fixed since Dom Kinnear. So it has to start there. And we can talk about the personnel's there. But, you can't – the greatest coaching in the world does not seem to be enough to get the current center backs to where they need to be.
Are we already mentioning Almeida and Stare in the same breath? Is that how history is going to remember Matias Almeida in the same light as Michael Stare? I think that's unfair, Asher.
No, I think defensively, yes. Offensive, in 2020 was awful for 100 different reasons, but there was 4 games that were a whole lot of fun and made it worthwhile.
I also like the tagline that you said, all or nothing, but mostly nothing. I think that's what, the Amazon documentary, All or Nothing, about the Premier League clubs, that would be the Earthquakes version. All or nothing, but mostly nothing.
Mostly nothing
is the Earthquakes version of that. Yeah.
Robert Jonas, how does this get fixed?
Well, I'm not going to go down the spend money route because I don't think that's true. But I did, kind of just look a little bit at the minutes of, that the different defenders played this year. And Nathan was at the top of the list, but barely. Tanner Beeson was right behind him in minutes. Paul Marie was right there in the, just above 2,200 minutes this season. So there was never that sort of that constant presence in the defense throughout the season. And to be fair, some guys I think took a step back. Nathan was a player that when he arrived, fist pumping and getting everyone excited and starting to draw comparisons to some some excellent center backs, especially in the Earthquakes past. And I don't think he really kind of fully took that role in the way people wanted him to. And maybe that's not the fault of anything other than maybe we see is what we get is what we get. But when you go through the revolution of the other players that came through, from Calvo and Beeson and others, and Oscar as well, never developing that consistency, I think, was such a huge problem. And for a team like the Earthquakes that are not going to go and take the gambles on the market and sign big DPs and hope they come out, they need to have some solidity somewhere. And if they can't get it in defense, they're going to be in trouble. Oh, the other name I was thinking, Judson. He was, people were calling him out as he should be, near best 11, a year or 2 years ago. And he really fell off in a way that I don't know if anyone had really anticipated. And I think that also, kind of doomed the defensive line to not having a shield in the way that maybe a lot of folks had expected. So I'm with you, Asher. The all or nothing, mostly nothing does seem to be a pretty good title for this year's DVD if they still do those things. And I think it would accurately reflect, probably the Quakes' biggest issue. If you can't protect the back, then nothing really moving forward is going to be of consequence, because you're always going to be playing from behind. Yeah,
it feels like, one of the things that I think would have been an interesting thing to reduce the variability would have been to start the year the way that we had anticipated the year would have been started, which was Almeida, playing the regular man marking, but with Beeson and, Nathan in the back, and, Judson at the 6, and you try it for the first third of the season. And I bet you Almeida survives the first third of the season if he just starts with something that was consistent game in and game out and kind of built on that consistency. Instead, everything felt like it was always just like constantly changing, but never the experiment that you wanted to see. Never with the right people in the right place in the ways that you're like, this would be really interesting to be able to do. It was always like, what the heck? Like Jackson Ewell as the center back was a good example of that, was mentioned before.
The 3-6-1.
Yeah, and some of the strange formation type stuff to start the season, coming out of the gate with, 3 in the back. And then, Nathan, by the way, goes down and never played again under Almeida. That was another thing that happened from that first game. So it felt like there was just this constant set of changes, and this team never quite found like the right combination to be able to play well. And then at the very end of the season, you're left like seeing Nico Chikaris and Jamiro Montero together, and you're like, why couldn't we have seen a lot more of this? We got it for 3 games, and it left us wanting a bit more in a lot of ways.
I don't think Nico Chikaris could have played that way at the beginning of the season. I think his growth trajectory over the course of the season was really impressive, and I don't think that he would have been as comfortable playing in Matias Almeida's system with the man marking. So I think that Alex Cavello being head coach was one of the reasons that Nico Chikaris was able to thrive towards the end of the season.
No, but we were asking for Nico as early as like early August. And
yes,
it didn't happen until several games later. Earlier
than we saw him, for sure. And I think it is true, undoubtedly, that the midfield is probably the biggest cause for a lot of this unpredictability and struggle that the Earthquakes had this season. Because in past years, whatever else is going on the field, and there's been a lot, you could pretty confidently predict who is going to be starting in that midfield, whether it be Judson alongside Jackson Ewell 2019, whether it be Eric Remedi alongside Jackson Ewell. This season, that was up in the air the entire season, whether it be Judson and Eric Remedi, Jackson and Remedi, Jackson and Judson, and whether it was Montero in the middle or somebody else in the middle. The Quakes were never able to figure out.
Sometimes that was weird.
Jackson at the 10 as well. Gregu's thrown in all sorts of positions. They just never had the midfield figured out, and that meant the defense was super vulnerable. I think that the defense leaking goals was the biggest problem. They allowed 69 goals this season, I think, which is right up close to that MLS record. And the reason is because they didn't have stronger, midfielders, a destroyer protecting the back line. And look, Nathan getting injured was unfortunate. Calvo leaving was unfortunate. There were issues in the defensive personnel as well, particularly in the second half of the season. But I firmly believe that a lot of those defensive issues started higher up the field with the lack of sort of stability in the midfield rotation.
So let's talk about the changes that did happen during the season, and then Colin, maybe we can start to get into a little bit of what we learned today from the roster numbers, and start to talk about how we think this roster might be changing. We already know, just as an example, Eric Remedi has said his goodbyes to the team. There are other rumors about other players, and while it would have been nice for the team to have made an announcement before today, they haven't yet, so it's all speculation for us. But you have Marcos Lopez going out for the largest transfer fee in a very, very long time for this team, and I guess you could say the modern Quakes era. And
have they had a larger fee ever?
There was
Eddie Lewis in 2002.
That's right.
Eddie Lewis at $2 million, right?
That's the rumor.
A history buff here.
And the other rumor is that Marcos Lopez, if he hit every incentive, would be closer to that number. But I think that one's probably going to stand. And then, Francisco Calvo, going for a few $100K. So those are two times where players got moved. And Colin, you referenced that before. 3 players got added, and it feels like other than Rodriguez, you didn't really get to see. We never saw Carlos Acapo play because of visa issues.
Indeed.
And also because of recovery from his broken foot. And then also we barely got to see Miguel Chaco play, but got to see him a little bit toward the very end of the season. So it was like, oh, we're not going to see anything. And then kind of we saw 3 things, but then none of them hit the field for a while. So how do you rate the fact that you have this good in the player movement, but you also have these defensive players that you could have used earlier in the season and you barely even got to see during the season. How do you rate Chris Leach's moves this season?
Yeah, I mean, the general concept that I've been putting out there about all this is for the most part, each individual decision that has been made under Chris Leach are things that I think are probably good ideas, but individual decisions sit in the context of every decision you're making and how you're planning, and those are the places where perhaps gaps are made. By the way, just to resolve the Starry Almeida discourse that has kind of been burbling in the comments here, you're right. It is absolutely a disrespectful comparison because Almeida's XG numbers were much worse than Starry's for the last 3 years. So I don't want to disrespect our former Swedish manager by comparing him to that level. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, I still got it.
Colin's making some enemies in Greece right now. Just wait till the Greek blows up in the comments.
Yeah. So as for the future-looking discussion, right? So Trauco, I really like, and by the way, the number that MLSPA. So we should do a big caveat for our audience here. MLSPA has been putting out the numbers associated with salaries for I think almost 10 years now, and it's good. It's very good. It's very accurate. It's more visibility and transparency than any other league in world football has. However, it's not perfect. There's 2 big gaps. One is occasionally they're going to get the compensation numbers wrong. And in my experience, those mostly have to do with bonuses of the very high end players are typically where they're the most, the shakiest. And then I would say secondarily, obviously doesn't account for transfer fees and anything related to that. So you don't really get a full picture of the spending just by looking at the MLSPA. So Miguel Trauco was listed as $150,000 in guaranteed comp on an annualized basis. I think that might be a tiny bit below what he's going to actually make, with the incentives, but that's an incredibly good deal for a Peru international left back who's proven himself, who's played in a top European league. That's a really, really good deal. And we saw him.
It's worth saying that's Matt Bersano money. Is basically.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is an incredibly for a starting fullback in MLS. That's a very, very, very good fee, a very good rate. Marcos Lopez was twice that, and he signed as a much younger, less proven player. As an example, Tommy Thompson is practically twice that as another example. So Trauco it's an incredibly good signing, even if it ends up a little higher with incentives. I think it reflects their bargaining position with Trauco was on the free agent market probably longer than he thought he was going to be. And that gave the Quakes kind of a good leverage to go get him. And what we saw of him, I mean, we didn't really get much of a show of what, Trauco will be, but definitely he looked like he could be a solid left back in MLS. On the right side, I like Akapo's tape. This number was a little bit higher than I was thinking, but kind of right about where I would have guessed it being. He's a La Liga guy, right? He was in that salary structure over there. I think that he's John just a bit over $500,000. That sounds about fair to me. It's on the high end of what the San Jose Earthquakes have ever wanted to pay their fullbacks. I actually think it might be the highest salary that they've ever paid for a fullback. It's just a position traditionally that teams in MLS like to save money and spend those dollars elsewhere. But I think he's a very good player, and I think he's necessary as well because I think that I actually quite like Paul Marie's contribution this season. But other than that, I think they needed probably a little bit more. Rodriguez being listed at $600,000 is perhaps a little bit on the high side of what I was expecting. I would have probably guessed something more in the 450 zone. But I think that it's, a good quality center back is a higher pay scale than a good quality fullback because it's actually a higher value position. And I think that, quite frankly, it also reflects the fact that was at the very end of the transfer window and they were a man short in central defense and they needed that transaction to get pushed across the line. So I think they did an amazing job with the Trauco transaction. Akapo, somewhere in the middle. Rodriguez, they probably had to pay a bit of a premium to get him in the door just to cover that need. I would say all three, however, were signed with next year in mind. Because I think that the season was lost at the point they made the transaction. They knew Akapo had a health issue that he was going to be working back from. He and Rodriguez both had visa issues that kept him out for a long time. I think that all of these things were done for next season. And I don't believe there's any guaranteed years on the Trauco or Akapo contracts past 2023. So they have them for next season. If they don't like them, they can cut them loose. They're both on the older side of players, so it's possible that they will as well. So those are individually defensible transactions, but none of them are moving the needle.
Can we also briefly just mention very briefly while we're talking about the salaries, some players that need to get their bag up because Benji Kokanovic needs to get his bag up after this season, making $85K after the season that he's had, the impact that he's had on this team, not just this season, but also last season. Nico Shakiris as well on $65K. Together, they make less than Gilbert Fuentes did. Those are both players who I think should be rewarded with much larger paydays in the next few years. And I think it's probably incredible. I think that Benji Kokanovic is the only player making $85K in world soccer who's had an offer come in for him, worth more than seven figures. I think that disparity between his salary in MLS and the offer that AEK Athens were, reportedly made for him halfway through the season is just a crazy disparity to me that I think only happens in MLS.
Well, Alex, you have a reported offer for Kate as well that we think is in about the $4 million range from Rhymes, correct? So
I don't know if it was that high, but
reported. That was the public information that was out there was for. I don't know. If it's
I will cast a little bit of doubt on that.
Cast some doubt on that. Perfectly fair, but let's say it was more in the Benji Kokanovic range or even slightly higher than that. Colin, you're the
Ismail Kone is getting paid less than Benji, and he's going orders of magnitude up this offseason.
Could I throw an aphorism out there?
How do you construct this roster then? If you want to take advantage of supplemental roster and homegrown space, how do you pay these guys what they're worth while still keeping, what you would want to have to be able to bring in veterans, right, on the senior side?
Yeah, so I want to offer an aphorism that comes from my world now that I work in finance. You don't get paid the amount you deserve. You get paid what you have the leverage to negotiate. And that is like the pure capitalist ethos, and it applies here in MLS with the salary scale there. Benji Kokanovic was, at Sacramento State, he was getting signed, off of waivers. Didn't get drafted, right? Didn't come through the homegrown cycle. And he signed, even at the time, by the way, I noted it as an incredibly team-friendly contract because it's a rolling set of options. So every year, the team has the ability to get out of that contract. So that's an unbelievably team-friendly contract in certain dimensions. And it will expire. I actually don't remember exactly when, but there is a limit to their team control, certainly. So yeah, like the team, they placed a bet on a player who was not on the high end MLS radar. And he turned out to be, that's what, and there's times where they pay Gilbert Fuentes, a big into six figures as a 15-year-old, and they actually re-signed and extended him under Almeida at Almeida's request, by the way. And he never really turned out to be the MLS player. Both sides, both players and the clubs are always, each contract they sign is making a bet. They're making a bet on what the value of that player is going to be. There are times when they make a bet and they get it wrong and they pay the player too much and fans get pissed off at that. There's times where they make a bet and they hit the jackpot, and that's Benji Kikanovic. And I think that, there's some kind of balance that needs to be understood of, like, that's just kind of how it is. Now, of course, at the end of team control, or as they get towards the end of team control, once they kind of get more control of their own futures, that's when they can get those big escalations and get a promotion and a big pay raise from where they are. So the team basically has the option of either soliciting offers and taking in a big transfer fee for Kikanovic and reinvesting that in the team and never bothering to pay him themselves, and they just let the next club do so. Or they can try to sign him for a longer team control contract and hope either he continues to improve and continues to contribute, or that it will help increase their leverage position when they're thinking about selling him abroad. It'll be interesting to see how they handle that. I don't know what their thinking is on that issue, but with each player, you have to kind of keep that in mind. Is like each side is best. They're making a bet on where they think their performance is going to be. The Quakes got it very, very right with Benji Kikanovic, which, by the way, fits in my opinion, with the theme of excellent amateur scouting. That I actually think is one of the strengths of this club. Kikanovic was pulled out of Sacramento State, not through the draft process. That's a really good get through amateur soccer in the United States. I know that this current regime was also very high on Drake Callender. Unfortunately, Jesse Fiorinelli and Matias Almeida were not high on Drake Callender. Therefore, they sold him for really not very much at all to Inter Miami, and he's now one of the 3 nominees for goalkeeper of the year. So I think that, the amateur scouting strength, that's when you get those lottery tickets. Some of them don't work out. Some of them do. When they work out, they are the most important things of building and constructing a roster, so that you pay market price for those veterans who have proven themselves.
By the way, Drake Callender ended the season while he was doing better at one point in the season, ended the season on an even goals minus expected goals for a keeper. And a lot of people are questioning that he should have been in that short group. But I get you, Colin. I understand the Drake Callender situation and the decision. I can tell you in hindsight was, basically it was either going to be make a bet on Emmy or make a bet on Drake, but they weren't going to make a bet on both. And they made their bet on Emmy, and we'll see how that turns out. It's hard to say.
We should also mention some of the other amateur players that they pulled. John Bell, who plays for New England Revolution, and Danny Masovsky, who now I think is at RSL, but was very successful.
Danny Masovsky, always a sore point on this show.
Always a sore point on this show. The amateur scouting has been really strong, and it's something is kind of unique in the world.
So we've got some questions over here starting to form, but I want to hit it back over to Asher and Robert a bit. As well before we start to get into that part of the show here. Guys, these moves that were made during the season, do they get the team in a good position for next season? Are you concerned about the moves? Are you concerned about the timing on the secondary window? Or is it doesn't matter because the season was over? Let's focus on 2023.
Well, I'll start with that. Again, the biggest change that we're going to see in the offseason is in the coaching staff. And I don't know when specifically conversations were happening between Chris Leach and Luchi Gonzalez about maybe looking ahead to next year, when Luchi maybe didn't let Chris know that, he was going to significantly take the potential role, and maybe if it was offered to him, go ahead and sign that contract. So these are players that are signed. Are they signed with the new coach and the coaching staff in mind, or are they pieces that Chris Leach is putting on the board and Lucci's going to make the decision as to what he wants to do with them? So it's disappointing in some ways to spend a whole year, at least another transfer window or an open window to bring players in that you still don't really know where they're going to fit in the long term, or even in the short term for that matter. So I think that's some important context to consider. At least that's something I've been thinking about since they sort of started the summer transfer window with no activity and just sort of kind of got a few guys guys in at the very end, that it did seem, it just didn't seem very kind of thoughtful with a new coaching staff coming in. And again, if these were conversations behind the scenes, fantastic. Maybe these are the guys Lucci was commenting on, or at least the style of player that he was going to be wanting to build his roster around. It's a difficult challenge, I think, in any circumstance when you're going through a coaching change. But the Earthquakes coaching change, since it took so long to complete, I think did really kind of create a bit of an uncertain transfer window, and maybe some uncertain objectives in that transfer window. Throw it over you to Asher.
Yeah, let me get the window back out here. Go ahead, Asher.
Oh, we're good. No, it was a total lost transfer window. I mean, having two viable fullbacks is two more than existed. Okay, one more with Marcos Lopez before, when the season started. So that's great. I'm a little bit concerned about having four of the international slots on the defensive side. And I'm not convinced that Rodriguez is that much better than Oscar Agrin, depending on what you're looking for your defense. But something Robert said is absolutely true, is that now this team has, in theory at least, there will be a coaching staff built around what Luchi Gonzalez wants to do, and they'll be able to actually pick players, find players, scout players, develop players that fit into an MLS structure, and not just guys I like, not just football manager style, which seems like a lot of what Almeida was doing, a lot of what happened in previous regimes as well. I think there'll be some intentionality here. I think that's great. I think that I hear Jamon, Colin, and Alex talk about great decisions that Leach made. I think there's been plenty of misses as well, especially in the midfield. Talking about amateur scouting or in MLS, there's Remedi, Grey Goose, George Asamani, Jack Skane. That's four different guys who are none of which are actual defensive caddies for Jackson Ewell, can back up Judson, can play defensive mid at MLS level. They just haven't solved that when it was clear from 2020 that Judson was a step slow. So there's some issues in roster construction that really have to be resolved this winter to have any chance of having a watchable 2023. But I think they can do that, if they actually get a structure in place and have some, meaningfulness about how they're going to do that and how they're going to fill in a lot of the spots. There's a lot of interesting flexibility in the roster, both in terms of the gaps in it, but also just guys like Paul Marie, Tommy Thompson. There's the big question of what do the wingers, what does this look like? And I don't think we have anything to go off of right now. I'm hoping we can learn a little bit watching the national team and seeing what Lucci does with Berhalter there. I can talk a lot about that, maybe a little bit closer to the World Cup time. But right now we're really just not 2022, not this sort of thing of trying to bash square pegs into round holes for an entire season.
Yeah, I think that point about watching the national team is a good one, because realistically, the Earthquakes are not going to make any major decisions while Luchi Gonzalez is working at the World Cup. So it's going to be, I think, a pretty quiet few months at the club while the World Cup is happening. And I think that Earthquakes fans will have a lot to learn about watching the way that the U.S. team plays and the way that Greg Berhalter is setting them up, because that's in a system that Luchi Gonzalez has been integral in constructing, and could realistically transplant to San Jose. So I'm going to be focused on the World Cup for the next month. Come back to me in January for any questions about roster construction.
I'm kind of with you, Alex. And there's been some chatter in the Slack about the potential of any sort of U.S. national team aftershock thing just for Quakes fans. So if any of you guys are interested in doing a show, and fans, if you want to see something like that, give us your feedback. Would you like to see a USMNT focused aftershock during the World Cup? Let us know. So Colin, we want to get into the roster construction questions. We've been raising some of these. I thought Asher made some really good points in terms of maybe some midfielders who don't have a really clear defined role, at least coming into Luchi Gonzalez's tenure. Maybe he'll have a better idea on some of these. I know we've seen situations like Jack Skane, for example, playing outside back. It turns out he's the second fastest guy on the team. Who knew? Not me, but he had the second top speed on the team this season. So, what do we want to get in here in terms of like, what are the contracts? Who are the players that you think are a bubble to come back? If there's anyone besides Remedi you think is a sure bet, what is your contract information say is likely to happen as we see these roster announcements come out?
So to a certain extent, I'm just going to be reading off of my spreadsheet. So for all of you following along at home, you can just check that out. But I'll read some big ones here. So for either players who are going into an option year that I think that is going to be declined, or for players who are straight out of years of contract left or years of control left. So Jan Gregush has an option for 2023. I think it's somewhat likely that gets declined. Eric Remedi and Judson are, I believe, done in their guaranteed contract. Obviously, we've already heard from Remedi that he's likely not back. Shea Salinas is retiring. Tommy Thompson is, I believe, at the end of his guaranteed contract. It's possible that he'll get a contract again to come back for less, but that's a question for the front office. I doubt they would bring him back on $280 a year like they have him right now. Paul Marie has an option for next year. I imagine that would be picked up. Matt Bersano has an option for next year. I imagine that'd be picked up. Siad Haji is probably done with his team control years, and I don't think that's going to be picked up. I think he's just never going to break through. Gilbert Fuentes has a 2023 option, and that's definitely not going to get picked up. George Asamani has a 2023 option. I imagine that wouldn't be picked up either. And then there's a couple of 2023 options for guys who you would want to keep around, but those are the main ones. Actually, no, that's kind of it, really. Beyond that, the only other thing I would say, just in terms of purely informational stuff, is there's a couple of the good players on the team, the valuable players on the team who are, their contracts are obviously a year shorter than they were last year. And generally speaking, you want to keep everybody at least at 2 years of team control left in order to have some amount of control over their fate. So if you want to sell somebody, you want at least 2 years of guaranteed control left. That's the position the Quakes are in with Cade. That's not the position the Quakes were in with Marcos Lopez, who ran his contract down to basically 6 months left before they managed to sell him directly. So I think there might be a little bit of movement on some of the higher value players on the roster. They have most of their young players locked up at least for a little while. Jackson Ewell is at least 2023. Let's see, Jeremy Bobasee's to 2024. Cade Cowell, they have a couple, good years locked in there. But Christian Espinosa is probably at the end of his initial contract or darn near it. So they have to kind of decide on a couple of those guys what they want to do over the long run. And by the way, Benji Kikanovic is the same issue. That he has team control through 2024. So the team really can do what it wants in this cycle. And they can decide whether, to risk it and wait or to sign him and tie him down in the long run or to sell him now. And it is probably worth mentioning, as to Coach Bakari's comment in the chat, yes, the contract situations, these are not people, I grew up playing Football Manager, right? It's a spreadsheet game. You make offers that are accepted or not, and you move people around and they're just electrons on a screen. Obviously, these are actual players. And so contract situations do impact players' psychology on the field as well. And you see that in all the American sports and all the sports, really. So there's a couple of guys like that where they're going to have to make a decision of sign long-term, wait it out, or sell now.
Colin,
yeah.
I think you're underestimating Football Manager. I had some pretty damn headstrong players in Football Manager. They were putting in some suspect performances when I wasn't giving them those contracts. I think the real world advice also applies in Football Manager.
Asher, I think there's something you had in mind.
So let's bring up some of these players that we think are maybe have some question marks around them as to, should they be back? Are they a fit? Should, Lucci give them a chance with a year? Let me just put out some names that I think are at least question marks in terms of, are they a fit going forward? I think there's Tommy Thompson. Many fans have raised him in the chat. Paul Marie, to some extent as well. He just got a year, correct, Colin? So it's another option for this year?
I believe so, yeah. Yeah,
I think that's right. What do you do at the goalkeeper position? Do you continue to bring back Matt Bersano as the backup? I think there's a potential question mark there. who am I missing? Jackson Yueill is a question mark. Let's just be honest about it. It's a question as to whether he is more of a positive or more of a negative, going forward in terms of this team's ability to be able to make the playoffs. What other question marks do you guys have?
Sorry, what's the question mark about Matt Bersano? I missed that.
Well, just, do you continue to bring him back as the backup? Because I think he also is just getting like 1 year and then maybe an option or not. So originally he was not going to be kept. He was released, and then they signed him and brought him back to be the backup.
I think
go ahead, Alex.
Well, I think Matt Bersano, he got his first MLS, minutes, I think this year, and I think put in, a solid shift. I think he's a great guy to have around the club. So I don't have any questions about Matt Bersano, but I want to let Asher answer the real juicy ones here.
Yeah, Greg Gooch is another one that people are talking about in the chat.
I think in terms of Tommy Thompson, I guess a corollary to Colin's bit about, your contract is what you have the negotiating power for is, your second contract. A lot of that is, are you more valuable here or are you more valuable elsewhere? For someone like Tommy Thompson, is he going to get a better contract elsewhere? Does he, is he a Bay Area institution? Those are the sort of things that go into it. I don't think there's much. I think he is who he is at this point, and who he is for San Jose is someone who can play, probably 4 to 6 positions pretty solidly. There's a lot of someone like Tommy McNamara in his game. He can be a really good person who can back up either Montero, whoever the other 8 is, if it's a dual 8 system, as well as we've seen him at a fullback. He can do a lot, and he's an institution, bilingual. I don't think he would go anywhere unless St. Louis really sees him as like a core of their new team, something like that. So when I could see go is Benji Kikanovic. I don't have any information here that other folks on this call might have, but when you think about someone like you're talking about, does it affect his play being on such a low number? Probably not. I mean, he's professional. Does it affect how someone like him feels about San Jose Earthquakes and how he talks with San Jose Earthquakes? Yeah, I think that's the sort of thing that can affect professional as well. I think about someone like him who, probably should be getting a ton of minutes at the 9. I don't think those minutes are really available behind Jeremy Ebobisse right now. Could a place like St. Louis, who has a huge Bosnian population, really want to have a young, brash American Bosnian number 9 and have a lot of game to throw around for it? Yeah, I think that might make a lot of sense. And then you also have to go into the fact that both him and Cade played very similarly in a lot of ways. One of them should be getting 2,000 minutes at left wing. And I think who that is a really interesting conversation. So we can really spend all night talking about maybe. But Cade's definitely the one who San Jose has made a bigger investment in so far. And the only way I could see that playing out any other way is if you're thinking maybe Christian Espinosa's on his way out. I have no idea. I have no idea why that would be unless it's a real formational fit sort of thing. He seems like he's also such an institution. But you have these, depending on the formation, depending on how people see their futures going, I think those are things that have to be kept in mind when we talk about where these players are going. And then you start thinking like how someone like Husseini Buddha, Oscar Agron, people who have really, really good pedigrees, some really, really exciting players. Buddha unfortunately just had a really tough luck injury at the end of the year. He seems like he'd be a great fit, in Montero's role or somewhere in the left wing as well. So we want to make sure you're getting minutes and thinking about how you're setting this team up for 2024, 2025, while keeping in consideration that players want to be part of a professional organization, treat them like professionals. And those are the sorts of things that, it's important to keep in mind when we're talking about how we're going to fit on this roster.
Robert, I know you're going to head out here fairly soon. What are your thoughts in terms of what you're expecting to see this offseason, given these contract situations?
There's some interesting questions in there. I think the Tommy Thompson one is more maybe an emotional decision as opposed to a true consequential signing one way or the other. He has a role to play or can have a role to play, but I think we've agreed that he's not a regular above average MLS starter at any of those positions that we've seen him play at. but he can flesh out a good role as a bench player and as a backup player. So, do the Quakes want to keep him on to as the feel good factor, or do they truly see the value in him? So I think, maybe if there's no other takers, that, Tommy gets to continue his stay in San Jose. I want to go back to Cade Cowell. I mean, I've got him listed here on my true storylines for the offseason. The fact that the Earthquakes have shown they're willing to part, or at least sell some players and actually make some money on those sales is encouraging. That's not really something that the Quakes have done for many years with any sort of success. I mean, in the new Quakes era, you have to go back to Ampai Patakuan, I think, this is the guy who they got $10,000 in a bag of soccer balls for back in the day, and that was like John Doyle's perfect transfer, or highest transfer he ever had. And I probably am missing a few in there, but I don't think I'm too far off. Cade Cowell is an asset that somehow, and I would imagine that this is something that's going on in discussions, needs to be showcased in a way, and he needs to step up to that showcase so that they can really leverage that to get a great transfer fee. He is the kind of player that MLS put forward. They named him to the All-Star team, not this year, but the year before, as a way to get his name out there. There's a lot of folks that are heavily invested in what Cade Cowell can be in that international transfer window. And so if I'm the Earthquakes front office, if I'm thinking about things in the plans for 2023 and maybe beyond, it's what am I doing to kind of fit that into the planning to really get Cade the minutes he needs, or give him the opportunities he needs? And is Cade Cowell going to step up to those opportunities? Because those two things together, I think, are a huge part of how some of these other pieces fit in to the puzzle. Is if he's expected to be here for more than the season, then you plan for it. If he's going to be sold in the nearest transfer window, and if that's already kind of been decided, then I think that's where you're going to see a few of these signings come. But definitely a player that they need to and should be doing a lot of work on. I want to kind of recall that Jackson Ewell, for many years there, Almeida was touting him as the big thing, that he was going to have a big European career, and haven't really heard a lot of that, in more recent times. I don't want to see Cade necessarily kind of fall into that same trap where he sort of stagnates and just doesn't, get to the level where the Quakes really do cash in on his potential.
And we get number 3 from Jamon Moore.
I see my wife comes in here, has to ask me a question in the middle. That's what happens. No, I want to say a quick thank you to all the fans who came tonight. I know Monday night with the playoff game going on is a tough thing. Hopefully, if you're interested in the playoff game, you got it on in the background. But this is all leading to something, right? And Alex and Colin, get us started in this part of the conversation here. So, you have a situation that Chris Leach has inherited. We know he's got ideas in terms of what he wants to do with the first coach that he hired. And, and probably had a good idea. Lucci was going to be his guy. They did a thorough search, but probably going in, he knew that. He knew the style that he wanted to play. Cavello, by the way, represents a lot of the style that we know Chris Leach wants to play. He said that publicly before. And he set up this roster with a lot of flexibility while still trying to retain a good amount of talent to give the 2022 season a chance. It didn't go, very well obviously from a results perspective. So is all this, clearing of the deck, all this changing, of these parts of the roster, like where does this go under Lucci? How much cap space, potentially, Colin, if you have an idea, are we talking about clearing off here? And, what do you think that actually means when you hear Lucci say that he's been told that there will be investment from the ownership of this team? What do you think that actually means in MLS, roster building terms? And what level of investment, giving that the Quakes are now at 25th out of 28, Colin, I think it is.
Yep.
In the league in spending, where do they get to?
Yeah, and by the way, had they not closed the Trauco transaction at the deadline of the free agent day, they would have been 26th. And had they not closed the Akapo and Rodriguez transactions at the deadline of the secondary window, they'd have been 28th, dead last. So there was a period of time there where it was really bare bones. So
by the way, there are very, very fine margins between some of these teams.
Indeed.
So the difference between like 25th and like 15th Colin, do we got you? I think we might have frozen on Colin a little bit. Alex, you want to jump in here?
I got a freeze as well. I can hear you now, but I'm not sure where everybody else is at. I'll just add that, look, I think that the team should build around Espinosa, should build around Montero, should build around the guys that they know can deliver. I was taken aback a little bit when I think you mentioned, Asher, that there are question marks around Christian Espinosa's future, because Christian Espinosa has been a linchpin in this offense for multiple years. And on one of the shows we had at the end of the season, Jamon said he thought Christian Espinosa was the MVP. I don't think Christian Espinosa was the MVP this season. I think that Jamir Montero was the offensive MVP this season. But I think that he's a guy that you should be counting on. And I think that absolutely there should be room for Nika Shakiris to have opportunities. There should be room for Cade Cowell in this roster. But I don't think those are guys that you want to build around. I think you want to build around the guys who can deliver, and bring in guys who can deliver. Bring in guys like Jeremy Abobasi, who have a proven track record in MLS. And we've seen the success of transactions like that. So I feel like the Quakes have a really strong core around which they can build this season. I don't think there's a ton of doubt about that core. I think that the biggest spot is the midfield and figuring out that number 6 position. That's where I think the team needs to invest heavily this offseason is that number 6.
I got that last part and it's dead on, right? Sorry about that, everybody. Could I just briefly, hit some of those numbers that were coming in and out, just kind of set the table for it. But exactly what Alex just said, that it's clear to me, from talking to the team, that a difference-making, defensively oriented midfielder is probably the number 1 priority in the team. I think that's music to the ears of everyone here or on the show, probably most of the people in the audience as well. That does seem like the keystone that was missing this year. In the most important way. By the way, big shout Eric Williamson, another Portland Timber in his early to mid 20s, who's expressing discontent. Let's go get him. That's not
from
reporting,
DC
by the
too.
way. Yeah, he's from DC.
He grew up with Chibo. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, Jabo and Eric Williamson, maybe they have some chemistry we don't know about, dating back to youth soccer days. Although I think that Williamson was from Virginia and Jabo is from Maryland, if I'm got it correctly, on other sides of the DMV. Anyway, he's not necessarily the solution. I think it's fun to have a player like that, and kind of pull the same trick on Portland, but that's definitely the number 1 priority. For the numbers thing, going into the summer, they actually, to my knowledge, had a decent buffer already in terms of their on-cap spending ability. Like there actually was some cushion, and then it got bigger. Because they sold Marcos Lopez and they sold Francisco Calvo. All those transfer fees kind of go straight into the allocation money bucket. In terms of salaries, the salaries out for those 2 players are about the same as the salaries in of the 3 players they brought in. So the hard dollars, on-cap dollars, probably more or less about the same. Allocation money went up and they had a buffer to start with. So there are allocation monies and there are cap dollars that are available to spend going into this next year, without a doubt. The team also did save itself some money by not filling up the totality of its roster during the 2022 season. I bet you my life that was a part of the discussion with John Fisher of we are going to keep this purse strings very tight this year. If you're willing to give us a little bit more next year for our new coach. And I would just say that DP spending really should be thought of almost separately from what you're seeing on those allocation money and salary cap side. And that's how the ownership group thinks of it as well. If there's a really high-end player that they want to go get, let's say, for example, that they go out and get a really expensive left winger, that'd be another place that might make a lot of sense to spend a lot of money, depending on how you see things. It would be put to ownership and they would kind of vote on it, yay, nay. There wouldn't be the same. It's not like they have a $10 million budget and, Chris Leach can fill it up as he sees fit. It's if he identifies a particularly good high-end player that's kind of evaluated on its own merits. So for the on-cap stuff, I think that they have absolutely set themselves up to spend more money this year than last year. For the DP stuff, I think they'll be opportunistic, but I wouldn't necessarily count on it.
Okay, so I want to turn it over to Robert and Asher for their final thoughts first. I know they both need to head out, and Asher is on the Central Time Zone here. Robert, I'm going to go to you because I know you got a hard stop. Final thoughts, on the season, what you are looking forward to seeing in the offseason.
Well, the good news is my hard stop got moved a little later, so I can go on for a long time here. No, I won't do that.
I'm fuzzy, so I'm going to go.
Let's head over to Asher here. Asher, I want to make sure Asher gets his full time.
All right, Asher, you're on.
I'm in the same boat. I got no place to be. But no, I think that everyone's saying the same thing. DP number 6. When we're talking about the core of this team, Espinoza, Crystal, who knows a whole lot more what's going on than I do, certainly saying that it seems like he wants to stay. That's music to my ears. I mean, I think he's up there in the team MVP conversation. If you have Espinoza, Montero, Ebobisse as kind of your main core, those are all attacking players. I certainly realize I think higher of Jackson Ewell than a lot of folks here. He's not a defensive player, neither Cade or Benji. So that's definitely where the investment is. And it's where they've struck out so far. That since Judson came in 2019, they really have not signed a defensive-minded player that's been worth it that we've seen. So they really need to figure that out. And how they figure out, I think I've said it a couple of times, but if they're going to play in this U.S. national team style with the 6, 2 8s, 2 wingers, and kind of a pivot forward, that'll be they have the formation for that. They have the foundation for that. And if they're able to find the people they can build off, you're not going to find Tyler Adams coming through, but if you can find someone who's like that hyperactive and that willing to close down lines, it's interesting because I could see there's a lot of people in MLS that fit that. Hassani Dotson, Frankie Maya, New York Red Bulls. There's a lot of folks who could kind of Edwin Cerrillo's playing right now who could, I think he's on the bench, but there's people who could fill that and kind of be a young person, grow into that. But they really need someone with some international experience who's just a bulldog out there. And that's really what I want to see San Jose do. Someone who can really fill in what is the identity after Wondolowski. We haven't seen any of that in 2022. And that's the real question. Who's going to be the person who carries the sort of Goonies mentality, but also brings it in a sorely needed update, get out of the Buckshaw in your head for once and actually be a 2022 soccer team, 2023 soccer team. That's what we want to see. And that's what, honestly, for me, I'm waiting to see what they're going to come up with.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with the identity thing. I think that is a really important question, for this team going forward. Colin Etnire getting late on the East Coast. Appreciate you hanging out with us tonight. Why don't you give some final thoughts from your perspective, and then we'll kick it over to Robert and Alex.
I think that Eric Williamson, by the way, might be that hyperactive player. He has not played the role of a true 6 a lot, but I was actually, name drop here. I was talking to our boy Matt Doyle, the MLS Armchair analyst, and he said that he quite liked Williamson's brief cameo, playing as a true number 6 in the absence of Diego Chara. I could imagine that being a kind of a fit there. Kellen Acosta, I did just look up. Apparently his contract is up after this season. Those guys are not necessarily the rugged, enforcer type midfielders that, existed in a prior generation of defensive midfielders. I think that this generation, it's those hyperactive guys, the Tyler Adams types, or even the Weston McKennie types. Those are the kinds of guys that are becoming more valuable across world football. I'd love to see that. That's my number one priority. I'm not sure if it's a designated player, but a big investment in someone to sit beside Jackson Ewell and underneath Jamon Montero to complete that midfield in a way that makes sense. That's the big one for me. I think everything else is just more about finding depth and youth prospects that they like and moving on from the contracts that they don't. They're going to roll the dice again in 2023, and if it doesn't work, quite frankly, they probably have one more year before everybody's out of a job. So they give themselves, one more year and the ability to roll the dice again with a couple of contracts that come off the books after 2023. So I don't know. The one thing I would emphasize, though, with all of that is you bring in that big DP, or not DP necessarily, a well-paid, a big investment in a defensive midfielder. That might complete the team for 2023, but there's some kind of longer range things that they need to figure out about the Christian Espinozas of the world, about the Jackson Ewells of the world, about the Benji Kikanoviches of the world. So I actually think in a weird way, this offseason, with that one exception, is going to be more about 2024 in the long range picture than it is about 2023.
All right, Robert, kick it over to you for some final thoughts on the evening. Thanks for making it tonight and sticking around with us.
Oh, absolutely. It's I think of some of the offseason moves going into this year. The Quakes played the free agent market, the different mechanisms for reentry and getting Jan Grey Goose and specifically Jamiro Montero, a player that he's my MVP of the Quakes this year. Alex, I think you said something similar. He didn't get any of the official team awards because there wasn't an actual MVP award. They were offensive and defensive and this and that. But for a player that I don't think I wouldn't say the Quakes took a flyer on him, but they recognized a player that had talent that wasn't going to fit into Philadelphia's long-term plan, and they gave him a home and they gave him a spot, and to me he really excelled, and I would like to see the Earthquakes kind of reward him with that that trust in 2023 to be a player that is going to be your every game starter and a player that can really be a good anchor in that offense. That type of opportunity, the Eric Williamson, the Kellen Acosta potential, those types of interleague transfers that they could get, again, maybe could be a huge difference maker. I don't think anyone pegged Montero as the team's MVP at the beginning. I certainly didn't, but he really impressed, and I think that's where Chris Leach, knowing the league, Lucci knowing the league, can maybe find a player or maybe even two that they can spend that discretionary money on in a way that really does provide value. Seeing Jeremy Abobasi in the same kind of picture, he really kind of capitalize on getting his opportunity this year. 17 goals, fantastic for the player of his caliber, playing his minutes and on the contract he's at. That is again another place the Quakes really did a great job of in terms of getting a player that they can work with and they can build around. This is what Asher was saying as well. Those offensive linchpins are players you don't want to take for granted, and that's something that I want to make sure. I would hope the coaching staff really looks at it and says, okay, how can we take most advantage of having players like that? So for me, that's what I hope the offseason conversations are centered around. Taking advantage of the pieces that do work, and then kind of filling in those gaps as best they can.
All right, and last, definitely not least, Alex Morgan. You and I have been talking about this team all season long. Literally, what is there left to be said? This is the time to say it.
Well, look, I think everybody's done a good job looking at the future, projecting towards the future. This is the postseason postmortem show, so I do want to do some recap as well. This was the season of ridiculous transfer rumors. Benji Kikanovic, multi-million-dollar offer from Athens. Marcos Lopez, Cade Cowell, all getting big offers from Europe. This was the season of Matias Almeida's petulant post-match press conferences, the last of those kind that we'll get to enjoy in San Jose. This was the season of Chris Wondolowski on the touchline. We don't know if he'll coach again because that's not something that he's expressed a ton of interest in, but we got to see him on the touchline this season, and boy, was it fun. This was the season that Shea Salinas got to go out with a bang and score in the last match of his career. This could be Tommy Thompson's last season in San Jose. His contract is up at the end of the year, and we don't know if the Earthquakes will renew it. So when I look back at this year, I want to remember all of those fun moments. I'm glad I was, able to be here with all of you guys to tell all of those stories and to experience all of those moments with you guys. I think that in hindsight, I'll remember some of the veterans the most, because Shea Salinas gave a ton to this club, and I'm not sure how much I'm publicly allowed to say. We might have some fun Shea Salinas content coming your way this off season, so maybe keep your eyes peeled for that sometime soon. But I think Tommy Thompson also deserves a shout, because he's one of the longest tenured players on this roster, and regardless of the success he's had on or off the field, he's always a guy that's been willing to put in a good shift. He's always been optimistic, positive presence in the locker room. If he does go, I think he'll be missed for all of those reasons, even if people recognize that, the fit isn't right there in terms of soccer tactics anymore. But for all those reasons, I think it was a fun season. I don't think we're going to get another season with as many high scoring draws. I mean, the number of games that this Earthquakes team tied 3-3, 2-2, lost 4-3, won 4-3. I'm still a little mad because the two home games that I missed were the Seattle Sounders 4-3 victory that the Quakes had, and the 2-1 victory over LAFC. Tommy Thompson got both assists in that game. That was, two really fun games to watch. The atmosphere at the stadium in those games were electric, and it gives me hope and optimism that this club can recover, because it's not just about the team and the roster and the way it's constructed. I think that's a big element of it, and maybe where some of this change starts. But it's also about getting the fans excited to come back to San Jose, because I think that the club really hasn't been able to regain that momentum since they lost it during the COVID pandemic. I think that fans are still a little reluctant to come out in droves, and if they're not seeing results on the field. And so next season is a great opportunity to really pick up on that momentum and get some solid support from the fans. And I look forward to being back next season to enjoy all of that with such a wonderful team.
Yeah, and Crystal reminding us too, Tommy played the game of his life against LAFC. That game was a lot of fun. Absolutely. So Arfi thinks that the Shea Salinas new QE signing is confirmed, and that would be a good use of the Patreon budget. And there you go. Eric saying this was a fun season, in quotes. And you can take that however you like, because you could take that a lot of different ways. I do
As
think
Robert Jonas might say, of all the seasons of soccer I have watched, this was one of them.
This is one of them. Of all the seasons I have watched, this was one of the most variable of them, Colin. That's the way that I think I will remember this. The ups and the downs of this particular season, there's been very few like it that I think I've witnessed. When you think like this team basically had, 3 coaches, you could argue, given the Lucci signing in this season, that already tells you. If you had said before the season, we're going to, fire the first coach after the first 7 games, we're going to have an interim for the rest of the season, but in the middle of that, we're going to announce the coach for the next season. You'd be like,
they haven't done that since 2018.
This is going to be kind of a whacked out season.
We did it a few years ago, and we don't want to go back through the wilderness 2019 through 2021, right? Like,
there you go.
I'm maybe more of a skeptic than a lot of you, but you've all watched a lot more Quakes soccer than I have. So
that's right. As Michael says, it was technically soccer, so that's great.
I do want to double down, by the way, on the shout out. Alex was very right to do more summaries, and reflections on this year. We obviously kind of turned the page too quickly, but particularly about Shea Salinas, who is an absolute club legend. I think he's a great example of players that really connect with their fan bases. Just through his service to the club, and the community. He was also a sneaky productive player for a very, very long time. And I don't know, he was always very available and great with media as well. So I want to thank him. He's players like Shea Salinas are the kind of players that make a club worth supporting, especially when times were fairly consistently dark. Robert, you were saying in the chat, I want to hand this over to you because I think your very first interview was with Shea Salinas.
Yeah, it was a preseason game against the Houston Dynamo at PAL Stadium there in San Jose. And I was sort of going over to the locker room, and there's Shea coming off the field. He might have had a shirt on, he might not have. That was Shea's rookie season, probably his first game playing with the team. And I have the audio somewhere. I just have to rescue it off of probably an old hard drive, and I definitely need to dig it up because I'm sure he and I, sounding however much younger we were at the time, would make for some pretty good audio. But he's the kind of player that he never kind of excelled in any one season, but you appreciate the longevity, you appreciate the service, and I think as someone who's had an opportunity to kind of vote for folks that are in the Earthquakes Hall of Fame in the past, he's the kind of player I look at as kind of deserving of that title. He didn't set all the records, but he's the kind of player you'll remember for a long time for multiple seasons of contributions.
So yeah, Colin. So basically, Max, I think, is asking you to provide some off-season content in which you simulate the Quakes and help them get to the Club World Cup. Do you accept that challenge?
It's actually so Football Manager does a pretty poor job of simulating MLS. They don't really get the little intricacies right, so it's actually kind of easy. It's a little bit too easy to do, but yes, I'm very happy to do a Football Manager playthrough. We'll do a Quakes Epicenter Twitch.
That's a lot of confidence you got there, Colin. I feel like you have to take the challenge now.
I can show you saves where I've already done it. I assure you.
That's I have the FM22 touch, and I feel like I just tweaked certain settings, and all of a sudden the team was good. And I'm like, really? Is that all it takes?
4-2-3-1 gegenpress, you're good. That's
here's a challenge, gentlemen. Each of us have to go back and do FM as the 2022 San Jose Earthquakes of the offseason. See who comes out on top, and therefore we'll know the order of the opinions that we should consider next season. We'll know who to listen to.
Well, one of the first things I did is I asked Eric Rometti, sorry, Eric, and I added already Eric Williamson, Colin. So it's actually one of the things I did. Nice. And then when you brought up Eric Williamson the other day, I'm like, see?
Colin thought he had an original take. He thought he had an original one there.
Well, can I just say that in the full version of Football Manager of this most recent cycle, Judeson's salary is off by a factor of 10. They added an extra 0 to it, and so that makes him a little bit harder to unload.
Maybe just a little bit.
Good for virtual Judeson, though.
Good for him. $3.6 million.
Virtual Judeson raking in that money. All right. I can show you guys my Quake season in FIFA. I think I would probably be more interesting than my Football Manager. All right. With that, we're going to bring our show to a close so we can get those who are not on the West Coast to bed at a halfway decent hour and probably have to work tomorrow. So thank you. I just want to say it's been a great season from an Aftershock side. Again, another season, every single post game, we were able to put on a show. And that's because of the guys that you see here. Asher, thank you. Robert, thank you. Colin, thank you. Alex, thank you. Also to Phil, who wasn't able to join us tonight. A big thanks to him and others who joined us at various parts throughout the season, including people, that are not even from the Quakes and sometimes provided us some insight from other clubs. So it's been quite an interesting season, a lot of coverage, and we're planning to be back again next season. So I don't think the Aftershock's going to go away, and we'll see if with the changes that are happening, how that shakes things up. But it could be a very interesting off season at Quakes Epicenter as well. Alex Morgan already tipping you guys off. We are planning already some off season content that could be coming your way soon. And I don't know, guys, it looks like there's a lot of support for a national team, national team Aftershock. Not quite sure, how good we are at breaking down the national team, but if we got to give people a place to come and complain, after games against Iran and Wales and England, maybe we can be a part of that.
How about this idea? How about we have a live watch along with Matias Almeida? Invite Matias Almeida back.
Well, on the show. Almeida personally. I don't know why you're not in Greece, Alex. I would assume that you were an assistant at AEK Athens at this point.
They didn't meet my contract demands.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Wait, which national team are we supposed to cover? I only cover Cymdeithas Belgrade Cymru.
I would talk Canadian national team, particularly if the U.S. got eliminated and they were moving forward. I have no hatred for Canada. I figure I might need Canada at some point in my life. You never know. So
there's a couple Iranians on AEK, so maybe we should follow up with Almeida and see how they're doing.
There's a lot of Persian people in the Bay Area. They probably have more interested in the
US. Honor Steve Petashore.
There you go.
Team Melly veteran. We should do it.
Really nice to see you guys, by the way. Thanks for having me on.
Nice to see everyone again. And one last thing, of course, is the Slack. So, obviously, we are going to be around all off season in the Slack. So absolutely come and join us. Asher is pointing at the like, subscribe, notify. We are finally over 700. We're at 715. So be sure to like, subscribe, and notify. Help us push that number up. We'd love to get it to 1,000. And, as always, the Patreon is available. I should probably, pull up the branding here and remind you about it. And then, of course, one final thing. Oh, I got to reach over here, and I got it. And here it is. And if you haven't yet gotten it, the Aftershock scarf, a perfect holiday gift for someone on your holiday gift list this off season. So be sure to make sure you remember to go to the website and order your Aftershock scarf and give it to the Quakes fan in your life this holiday season. Makes the perfect holiday gift. I don't think I've ever said that before, but it seemed to make sense.
It's
right
warm, it's cozy for those long winter nights, just cuddling up.
That's right. And with
the
all
fire
with all the global
For those
warming,
of
which
us
means in the
who live in
wintertime you
the-
get global
yeah.
cooling, you're going to need it pretty soon. So get ready for the chill this off season. All right, everyone, we've really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. We're heading out, and we will maybe do something if there's news to share, and otherwise we will talk to you about the Quakes probably in 2023. Have a good rest of your evening. Good night.